He walked into a store, laughed at for asking prices. But what happened next shocked everyone. An old man, disrespected, underestimated, took control in a way no one saw coming. He bought out the entire store, then donated every single item to the people who needed it most. But why did he do it? And what does it reveal about power, dignity, and the community that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew? You won't believe the twist. Watch till the end. Don't miss out on the full story. Hit subscribe and stay tuned for the unbelievable twists ahead. Mr. Hayes stood at the window, watching the sun rise slowly over the neighborhood. The world outside was waking up, but for him, the quiet morning felt like a personal moment of stillness, a reminder of how much had changed over the years. His house, modest but neatly kept, had a familiar warmth to it. Shelves lined with old books, framed photographs capturing long-past moments of joy, and mementos of a life lived with purpose filled the space. The faded photograph on the wall of him standing alongside a group of young students in the early days of his teaching career brought a bittersweet smile to his face. He remembered their faces, eager and hungry for knowledge, just as eager as the world had been for change, back in the days when he marched for equality. Back then, he had been a man of action. Now, at 82, he often wondered if he had been forgotten. His son, Eli, hadn't been by in a while. Not that Mr. Hayes blamed him. Life was different for Eli, a man in his 40s now, struggling to find his place in a world that seemed more about keeping up with the pace than understanding the past. Eli had his own family, his own battles, and the distance between them felt like an invisible thread that had grown longer with time. Mr. Hayes tried not to let the silence between them weigh too heavily on his heart, but it was hard not to feel the absence of their connection. He turned away from the window, the moment of nostalgia slipping away like smoke. He needed to get to the store. The routine had been the same for years now. Wake early, brew his coffee, and then walk to the small convenience store at the end of the block. There, he would buy a few essentials: canned beans, rice, some fruit, whatever he needed for the week. He didn't rush. It wasn't about the items, really, but about the act itself, about getting out, about holding on to the small rituals that gave his life meaning. The air outside was crisp, and he pulled his old coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way down the sidewalk. He passed the houses where familiar faces peeked out from behind windows, some nodding politely, others pretending not to see him. People didn't notice old men much. They passed by, heads down, lost in their own thoughts. But Mr. Hayes wasn't bothered by it. He had grown used to being overlooked. His life had been a series of small, quiet victories and silent frustrations. But today, something felt different. He reached the store just as the first few customers began to trickle in. It was a small place, crowded with everything from cheap snacks to cleaning supplies. The fluorescent lights hummed above, and the smell of artificial lemon cleaner lingered in the air. The clerk behind the counter, a young man no older than 22, looked up as Mr. Hayes walked in. His name tag read, Kyle. Kyle was one of those people who wore his youthful confidence like armor. He stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips, scanning the aisles like he was above it all. He glanced at Mr. Hayes as he entered, but his gaze quickly returned to the magazine he was flipping through, clearly not interested in the elderly man shuffling toward the canned goods. The world, it seemed, had a way of making old people invisible. Mr. Hayes reached for a can of beans, carefully inspecting the label. He didn't need to look for a deal. It wasn't about the price. It was about the rhythm, the act of deciding, weighing, and then choosing. He picked up a box of rice and glanced at Kyle again, his voice soft as he asked, "How much for these?" Kyle didn't even look up at first. He was busy flipping through his magazine, his voice dripping with a kind of casual dismissiveness that only the young could pull off. "I don't know, maybe 50 cents each? But you can always ask one of the other old guys who come in here. They probably know better." He laughed under his breath, though there was no joy in it. Mr. Hayes, though he could feel the sting of the comment, didn't react. He simply placed the rice back on the shelf and reached for a bag of apples. "And these?" he asked, his voice steady. Kyle glanced up this time, just enough to see the old man standing there, asking more questions than he deserved. He raised an eyebrow and gave a short, dismissive laugh. Probably like a buck or something. You really need to ask about every little thing. Other customers who had been casually browsing the aisles turned their heads. There was a ripple of laughter, soft at first, but unmistakable. Mr. Hayes felt the weight of their eyes on him, the judgment, the unspoken agreement that he didn't belong here, that he didn't matter. He was an old man after all. What did he know about prices, about anything? But instead of reacting, Mr. Hayes simply placed the apples back on the shelf and turned to leave. His steps were slow, deliberate, his dignity unshaken. He didn't speak, didn't confront anyone. He just walked out, the door chiming behind him as the laughter continued to hum in the background. Outside, the cold air hit his face, but he didn't flinch. His heart was heavy, not with anger, but with something older, something deeper. He had been dismissed by many over the years, but something about today felt different. The laughter wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger. A sign of how little the world had changed in some ways, despite all the progress. It stung, but he wouldn't let it break him. Instead, it gave him a resolve that had been dormant for years. Mr. Hayes paused on the sidewalk and looked back at the store. He had lived a quiet life, mostly keeping to himself, mostly watching from the sidelines as others carried on. But today, something had shifted inside him. It wasn't just about buying groceries anymore. It was about more than that. "I'll be back," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like a promise, something he wasn't sure he had made before, not with so much certainty, not with so much fire. As he walked away, the weight of the day settled on his shoulders. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't let this moment pass. He couldn't let the world continue to forget him, to dismiss him, to mock him. Not this time. And so Mr. Hayes walked on, the first stirrings of something much larger beginning to take root. The following day, Mr. Hayes returned to the store. He didn't hurry. There was no rush in his step, but there was purpose behind it. He had woken early, just as he always did, and spent his morning in quiet contemplation, reflecting on the events of the day before. The laughter had stung more than he cared to admit, but it had also stirred something deep within him. Something that had been buried under years of silent endurance. Today, he would make a statement, but not in the way others expected. As he approached the familiar corner store, he could see Kyle through the glass, leaning lazily against the counter, his eyes fixed on his phone. The same smug expression was plastered on his face, as though he hadn't a care in the world. Mr. Hayes paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. He was aware of the way the world had a tendency to dismiss people like him, old, black, quiet. But that didn't mean he had to quietly accept it anymore. There were still battles to fight, even if they were small, personal ones. Today, this store would be his battlefield. He opened the door, the bell chiming as it always did, and Kyle looked up. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, quickly followed by a mixture of indifference and mild amusement. He had probably already written off Mr. Hayes as some old man who had nothing better to do than shuffle in and out of the store, asking silly questions about prices. But Mr. Hayes wasn't here to ask. He wasn't here to play the fool. No, today he had a plan. "Good morning," Mr. Hayes said, his voice warm but firm. Kyle didn't respond immediately, his attention quickly returning to his phone. It was clear that he wasn't bothered by the presence of an elderly man. If anything, he probably assumed Mr. Hayes was a non-issue, a piece of background noise in his day. But Mr. Hayes didn't take offense. He simply walked to the aisle where he had stood the day before. The familiar shelves loomed overhead, stacked with cans and boxes of every kind. It was the same store, the same shelves, but this time, it felt different to him. The weight of his intentions settled on his shoulders as he picked up a can of beans, the same one he had looked at yesterday. He glanced at Kyle, who was still absorbed in his phone. Mr. Hayes took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice carrying across the aisles with quiet authority. "I'll take everything," he said simply. "Every item in the store." Kyle looked up, blinking at Mr. Hayes as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, confused but not quite willing to believe what he had just heard. "You want to buy everything?" Mr. Hayes nodded slowly, still holding the can of beans in his hand. "Everything," he repeated, his tone steady, calm. "All of it. I'll pay for everything you've got in this store." Kyle, now more puzzled than amused, shook his head in disbelief. "Look, man, I don't know what game you're playing, but if you're trying to make some kind of joke, it's not funny." "I'm not joking," Mr. Hayes said, his voice soft but unwavering. "You've got the prices on the shelves, don't you? So go ahead and tally them up. I'll take every last thing." Kyle snorted, a sharp, cynical laugh escaping him. He stood up straighter, clearly trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "Look, old man, I don't know what your deal is, but there's no way you can afford all this. You're talking about thousands of dollars here." "Do you think I don't know that?" Mr. Hayes replied, his gaze steady. "I've got the means. I don't need your approval, but I do need you to do your job." Kyle blinked at him, his smirk slowly fading as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He was still skeptical, still leaning toward dismissing Mr. Hayes as some old fool who had wandered in off the street. But there was something about the way the old man stood there, calm and certain, that made him hesitate. He wasn't joking. This wasn't a stunt. With a reluctant sigh, Kyle grabbed a notepad from behind the counter and began scribbling numbers. Mr. Hayes watched him, noting the subtle shift in the clerk's demeanor. The dismissiveness had faded, replaced by a creeping unease. For a moment the world felt oddly still, as if time had slowed just enough for Mr. Hayes to be fully aware of every detail. The hum of the fluorescent lights above, the faint squeak of the floor beneath his feet, the distant sound of a car passing by outside. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this was no longer about the store, the money, or even Kyle. This was something deeper. Finally, Kyle finished scribbling his numbers, a look of disbelief still lingering on his face. He glanced up from the paper. "Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. Are you really sure you want to go through with this?" Mr. Hayes nodded. "Yes." Kyle hesitated, then slowly typed in the numbers on the register. The total flashed up on the screen, an amount that was far more than Mr. Hayes had expected, but it didn't make him flinch. It felt right. It felt like a statement, a challenge to a world that had long forgotten what it meant to respect people like him. "Are you serious?" Kyle asked, his voice wavering slightly. "You're actually going to buy all of this?" "I am," Mr. Hayes said simply, the words hanging in the air between them. For a moment, Kyle just stared at him, and the silence in the store grew heavier. The young man was caught between disbelief and confusion, unsure of how to react to this unexpected turn of events. But Mr. Hayes wasn't interested in his reaction. He was interested in something else, the act of making the world stop for just a second, to make people see him, not as an old man, not as a relic, but as someone who still had the power to surprise, to disrupt, to demand attention. Kyle, still uncertain, began to ring up the items. The sound of the cash register echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet store. The total mounted higher and higher, but Mr. Hayes didn't flinch. He simply stood there, waiting for the final tally. He knew the effect it would have, how people would talk about it, how the story would spread. It was more than just buying groceries. It was about showing that an old man who had been laughed at and dismissed could still make the world pay attention. As Kyle finished ringing everything up, he looked at Mr. Hayes once more. The amusement was gone from his face now, replaced by a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. There was no longer any hint of mocking in his tone, just a simple acknowledgement of the situation. "Okay," Kyle said quietly. "I guess that's everything." He slid the receipt across the counter. "That'll be, well, you know." Mr. Hayes took the receipt without a word and handed over the payment. It wasn't about the money, no. It was about something else. It was about forcing a change in the way people saw him, forcing them to pause and recognize that he had power too, that he could still make a difference, even if no one expected him to. As he walked out of the store, the weight of his actions settled on him like a cloak. It was done now. He had made his point. Now all that was left was to wait and see what happened next. The next morning, Mr. Hayes woke to a quiet house, the same as it always was. But somehow today felt different. The air seemed thicker, charged with a strange anticipation that he couldn't quite place. His purchase the day before was no longer just a private act. It had rippled outward, caught the attention of more people than he had expected. As he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, the faint hum of the world outside seemed louder, sharper, as if everyone was talking about him. He couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the whispers turned into something more. Eli hadn't called. Mr. Hayes wasn't sure whether that was a relief or a disappointment. His son had been distant for years, too wrapped up in his own life to notice what his father was doing, or had been doing. Mr. Hayes shook his head, reminding himself not to dwell on things he couldn't control. Today, he would focus on the small victories, on making a difference where he could. But as he took another sip of coffee, his phone buzzed on the table, breaking his thoughts. It was a text from his old friend Clarence. "You won't believe this, Hayes. They're talking about you on the news. All of it. You're buying out that store, the donations. People are saying all kinds of things. But I have to say, I knew you still had it in you. God bless my brother." Mr. Hayes sat back in his chair, staring at the text. He hadn't expected the news to pick up on his small act of defiance. It was a ripple, after all, not a tidal wave. But here it was, already growing, spreading. It was strange, seeing himself suddenly thrust into the center of attention again. For so many years he had been a shadow in the corner of his own life, quietly doing what was necessary, but never drawing attention. He wasn't sure if he liked it, but there was no going back now. The phone buzzed again, this time a call from Eli. Mr. Hayes hesitated before answering, a knot of tension tightening in his chest. "Dad?" Eli's voice came through, strained, like he wasn't sure how to begin. "I saw the news. What the hell was that about?" Mr. Hayes exhaled slowly, preparing himself for whatever was coming next. "Eli, No, don't give me that," Eli interrupted. "What was all that about? Buying out a whole store, and then donating it all? I don't get it. I thought you were smarter than that." Mr. Hayes's heart sank, but he kept his voice calm. "It wasn't about the store, son. It was about something else, something that needed to be said." "You're always talking about what needs to be said," Eli snapped, his voice rising. "But what good does any of that do? You think you're going to change anything by making some grand gesture? You think people are going to respect you now? They're laughing at you, Dad. They're laughing at us." The anger in Eli's voice struck a chord deep inside Mr. Hayes, but he didn't react. He had learned long ago that shouting back didn't help. Instead, he chose his words carefully, speaking with the same quiet conviction that had always been his trademark. "Maybe they're laughing, Eli, but laughter isn't always what it seems. Sometimes it's just fear of something they don't understand." Eli was silent for a moment, and Mr. Hayes could almost hear him working through the words in his head. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. "Look, I get it," Eli said finally, his voice quieter now, though still tinged with frustration. "I just don't know why you have to make everything so complicated. You're not young anymore. What good is any of this going to do? You've got your retirement. You've got your life. Why risk it?" "I risk nothing," Mr. Hayes replied firmly. "I've lived my life, and if I'm going to leave a legacy, I want it to be one that stands for something. Something that says, I mattered." His voice softened as he added, "I want to show you that we still matter, Eli, no matter how old we get." There was a long pause. Eli didn't respond immediately. Mr. Hayes could feel the distance between them growing even wider, but he wasn't sure what else to say. Perhaps his son needed time to understand, or perhaps he never would. "I'll talk to you later," Eli finally said, his tone a little more resigned. I don't agree with you, but I guess I can't change your mind. Just be careful, okay? I will, Mr. Hayes said softly, though he knew the conversation wasn't over. It never really was with Eli. He hung up and set the phone down, staring at it for a moment before turning his attention to the window once again. As the day wore on, Mr. Hayes found himself restless. He didn't expect things to change overnight. He didn't expect anything, really. But the news was already spreading, as Clarence had warned. People were talking. What had started as a simple act of defiance had taken on a life of its own, becoming a story in the local news. A strange little moment in a world that was increasingly obsessed with spectacle. The reports varied. Some outlets reported it with bemusement, others with disbelief. Most people who'd known him, neighbors, former colleagues, had seen it as an eccentric move, a testament to Mr. Hayes's unyielding spirit. But in the anonymity of the larger world, the story was beginning to take on a life of its own. There was no escaping it now. It wasn't just about buying groceries. It was about showing that he still had a voice. In one local broadcast, a reporter made a passing comment. Mr. Hayes, a former teacher and civil rights activist, shocked the neighborhood yesterday when he purchased every item in a small corner store and then donated the entire stock to local charities. Some are calling it a strange, albeit generous act of defiance. But could there be more to this story than meets the eye? The question lingered in Mr. Hayes's mind as he prepared for the next step. He didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but he felt a pull, like an invisible thread connecting him to something larger than himself. His world had been small for so long, but today, things were different. The store would be his next destination. This time, however, he wasn't just buying groceries. By the time evening rolled around, the ripple effect had begun to reach the corners of the neighborhood. Word had spread. The store, the one that had once felt so unimportant, now felt like a battleground. People talked in hushed tones, wondering what the old man was up to. Was he making a statement? Or was he just losing his mind? Mr. Hayes couldn't have known that in the days to come, his small act of defiance would become a catalyst for a larger conversation. A conversation that would eventually pull in those who had laughed and those who had doubted, in ways no one could have predicted. But for now, the store and Kyle awaited. And Mr. Hayes would be there. He had only just begun. The next afternoon, Mr. Hayes returned to the store. The crowd was a little thicker than before, but it wasn't the usual bustle of customers doing their regular shopping. There was an energy in the air, an underlying hum of curiosity, of speculation, that made the place feel different. He walked in slowly, carefully, as if the weight of his actions from the day before had somehow made the ground under his feet a little more fragile. But Mr. Hayes wasn't one to be intimidated by change, not after all these years. Kyle was behind the counter again, but this time, he wasn't slouched in his usual indifference. He stood upright, glancing nervously at the door every few seconds, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. His eyes flicked over to Mr. Hayes the moment he entered, a hint of wariness in them. Kyle was clearly still processing what had happened the day before. Mr. Hayes had expected that. After all, people didn't change their perceptions overnight, especially not when it came to someone like him, an old man who'd seemingly come out of nowhere to make an impact. Mr. Hayes, Kyle greeted him cautiously, his tone a little more respectful than the day before, though still laced with uncertainty. How can I help you today? I'm not here to buy anything, Mr. Hayes said, his voice measured, his gaze calm as he surveyed the store. Not today. Kyle raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. Okay, so, what's going on then? You just here to chat? Mr. Hayes smiled gently, but there was no humor in it. Number, I'm here to talk to you. I want to know what you're going to do about the donation. Kyle blinked, taken aback. The donation? He echoed, as if the word was foreign to him. What do you mean? You know what I mean, Mr. Hayes replied. You saw where that stock went. You know it's all in your hands now. I bought everything, and I gave it all away. Now it's your turn." Kyle looked momentarily confused. Then the gears in his mind started to turn. "Wait, you mean you want me to, what, organize the donations or something?" Mr. Hayes shook his head slowly, his eyes not leaving Kyle's. "No, Kyle, you don't understand. This is bigger than that. The donation was just a part of it. I want you to make sure it reaches the right people. I want you to make sure this store, the one that you work in, becomes part of something that matters." Kyle was silent for a moment, clearly trying to process the weight of Mr. Hayes's words. It was obvious he didn't quite grasp the significance of what was being asked of him, but Mr. Hayes wasn't going to back down. He had taken the first step. Now he was going to push this young man, this generation, to take the next. "You're asking me to, what? Like, make this store a charity?" Kyle's voice wavered, unsure whether this was some sort of joke or a genuine request. Mr. Hayes nodded. "Not just a charity, a community. A place where people don't walk in and look past the man in the corner, the old woman buying bread, the kid looking for something to eat. A place where people aren't invisible. A place that acknowledges those who've been forgotten." The words seemed to hang in the air, and Kyle shifted uneasily. Mr. Hayes could see the skepticism written across his face, and that was fine. It was a process. Change didn't happen all at once, and it certainly didn't happen without resistance. He had spent his life pushing for change, pushing against systems that would rather have ignored him and people like him. And now he was pushing again, not just for himself, but for the people who had no voice, the people who would never be asked to speak up. "You think people are going to come in here and just start donating and volunteering?" Kyle asked, shaking his head. "You don't get it. We're barely scraping by as it is." "I'm not asking you to do anything you can't handle," Mr. Hayes said, his voice firm but patient. "What I'm asking you to do is simple. All I'm asking is for you to make it possible for people who need a little help to come here and get it. Make it easy. Make it happen. That's all." Kyle's hands tightened around the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked more like someone who had been given a task that was too big for him to comprehend. A small part of Mr. Hayes wondered if he had made a mistake, if he was expecting too much too soon. But he couldn't back down. Not now. "What if I can't do it?" Kyle asked, his voice small. "You don't have to do it alone," Mr. Hayes replied quietly. "You just have to be willing to try." There was a long silence between them, thick with uncertainty and unspoken questions. And then, as if the weight of Mr. Hayes's words had finally sunk in, Kyle straightened up, his eyes shifting from the counter to Mr. Hayes. His posture changed, just slightly, but enough for Mr. Hayes to see that a seed had been planted. "I'll talk to the boss," Kyle said, his voice steadying. "But no promises." "That's all I'm asking for," Mr. Hayes said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "A promise isn't always necessary. Action is." Just as he was about to turn and leave, the door opened and a familiar face stepped inside. It was Mrs. Cunningham, an elderly neighbor of Mr. Hayes who lived 2 doors down. She was a regular at the store, always buying the same items: a loaf of bread, a jug of milk, a few cans of vegetables. She wasn't well off, but she made do, always with a quiet dignity. She paused when she saw Mr. Hayes and Kyle standing there, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Mrs. Cunningham had known Mr. Hayes for years, and she knew that when he made a statement, it wasn't just for show. There was always something deeper to it. "Well, well," she said, her voice soft but sharp with curiosity. "What's this about then?" Mr. Hayes smiled warmly, though his eyes never left Kyle. "Just making sure things are moving in the right direction." "Good," Mrs. Cunningham replied, a nod of approval in her voice. "We need more of that around here." Kyle looked between them, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. For a second, it seemed like he might retreat back into his old dismissive self, but something had changed in him. Just a little. Enough at least to make him pause. "I'll figure it out," Kyle said slowly, as if the words were unfamiliar to him, but he had no choice but to say them. I'll talk to the boss and see what we can do." Mr. Hayes nodded once, his job done for the day. He had planted the idea, and now it was up to Kyle and the store to decide what to do with it. As he walked toward the door, he glanced back at Kyle and Mrs. Cunningham. The store, once just a place where people came to buy things, was beginning to feel like a symbol of something bigger. It was no longer just about the transaction. It was about the exchange of dignity, of respect, and maybe, just maybe, of change. When Mr. Hayes stepped out into the cold afternoon, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted in the air. Something small, but significant. The ripple was starting to grow. The following days moved slowly, but there was an undeniable sense of momentum building. News of Mr. Hayes's donation continued to circulate through the neighborhood, growing in intensity with every passing hour. People who had never given much thought to the old man down the street were suddenly curious about him, about the act that had sparked so much conversation. There were rumors, of course, some mocking, some admiring, but in the undercurrent of every whispered conversation was something more, a sense that Mr. Hayes had done something that, while small in its outward form, was much bigger than anyone had initially realized. It wasn't just the donation that had people talking. It was the question of why. Why had he done it? What did it mean? Was it a protest, a grand gesture, a form of redemption? No one seemed to have the answers, least of all Mr. Hayes himself. He had never been the type to explain himself, to offer reasoning for his actions. He simply did what he believed was right. And now, the world was watching. Despite the noise around him, Mr. Hayes kept to his routine. He still woke early every morning, still drank his coffee alone at the kitchen table, still took his walks around the block, watching the world go by. But as he walked, he felt the eyes on him more than ever before. People seemed to recognize him now, nodding in passing, offering quick, polite greetings. Some seemed uncertain, hesitant, unsure of whether to acknowledge him or not. Others, like Mrs. Cunningham, offered quiet words of support, as if to say, "I see you. I understand." But it wasn't the neighbors or the idle chatter of the street that weighed on him now. It was the feeling that something was about to break, something big, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Kyle had kept his word, though Mr. Hayes could tell that the young man still wasn't entirely sure of what he was supposed to do next. He'd seen him a few times since their conversation, mostly behind the counter, looking over at him with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. There were no clear signs of change in the store, not yet at least. The shelves were still stocked with the usual items, and there hadn't been any major changes to the way customers were treated. But Kyle's posture had softened just a little. The way he interacted with customers seemed more thoughtful, less dismissive. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Mr. Hayes, something was better than nothing. That afternoon, Mr. Hayes made his way back to the store. The weather had shifted. A cold front had moved in, bringing with it a sharp wind and a hint of rain. As he walked, he pulled his coat tighter around him, his thoughts focused not on the weather but on the coming conversation. He knew Kyle was still figuring things out, still navigating the murky waters of responsibility. But Mr. Hayes also knew that sometimes the hardest part of change was simply showing up. When he stepped into the store, the bell above the door jingled as usual. Kyle looked up, his eyes flicking to Mr. Hayes before he quickly looked away, a slight flush rising to his cheeks. Mr. Hayes could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he fidgeted with a pen in his hand. It was clear the young man was still uncertain of how to proceed, but that was to be expected. Mr. Hayes walked over to the counter, his footsteps slow but purposeful. Kyle looked up again, managing a tight smile. "Mr. Hayes," he said, a little too brightly. "What's up today?" "I wanted to talk," Mr. Hayes said, his voice steady but gentle. "About what's next?" Kyle's expression faltered, the tension returning. "Look, I've been thinking about it, talking to the boss and all that. But I don't know if I can really make this place what you're talking about. It's just a small store, you know. We're barely making it as it is." Mr. Hayes nodded, understanding. "It's not about making it perfect, Kyle. It's about making it possible. People don't need perfection. They need something that works for them. A place where they don't feel like they're invisible. Kyle swallowed hard, clearly struggling to find the right words. I know you're trying to do something good here. I get that. But I don't know if it's possible. People just come in, buy their stuff and leave. It's always been like that. Change never happens overnight, Mr. Hayes said, his voice calm, unhurried. You're not going to change everything all at once. But you can start small. Start with the people who matter the most. You see them, don't you? The ones who come in every day buying the same things. The ones who never ask for help, but could use it. You can make a difference for them. Kyle looked down at the counter, the weight of Mr. Hayes's words settling heavily between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mr. Hayes wasn't sure what Kyle was thinking, if he was just humoring him or actually considering the possibility of change. But he wasn't in a hurry. He had waited decades to see his community shift, to see people like him recognized, and he knew that true change took time. I'll try, Kyle said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I don't know what it'll look like, but I'll try. Maybe we can start with something small. You know, make it easier for people to donate or maybe set up a corner for people to get what they need without having to ask. Mr. Hayes smiled, the expression full of quiet pride. That's all I'm asking for. Start with one thing, then see where it goes. Just then, the door opened, and Mrs. Cunningham stepped inside, her face bright despite the cold weather outside. She waved at the two of them as she made her way to the shelves. Mr. Hayes watched her, noting the way she carried herself, dignified, steady. It reminded him of the generations of people who had come before him, who had endured so much and still kept going. He thought of the people he had known, the people who had taught him the importance of quiet resistance, of standing firm even when the world around you seemed indifferent. Mrs. Cunningham approached the counter, placing a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk in front of Kyle. Afternoon, boys, she said with a smile. How's everything going today? We're working on it, Kyle said, glancing at Mr. Hayes before turning back to the register. Mrs. Cunningham raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Working on what? Making this place better, Kyle replied, his voice a little stronger now, as if the idea had taken root in his mind. Making sure that people who need help can get it. Not just the groceries, but what they really need. A little dignity, a little respect. Mrs. Cunningham's face softened. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at Kyle as if she were seeing him for the first time. Then she smiled again, this time with more warmth, more understanding. Well, she said, tapping her fingers lightly on the counter. I'm glad to hear it. You've got my support. I've been waiting for something like this for a long time. Kyle blinked, clearly surprised by her response. You're serious? Of course I am, she replied, her voice steady, but laced with the kind of certainty that comes from having lived through hardship and come out the other side. People like us, we don't wait for others to make change. We make it ourselves. Mr. Hayes looked at Kyle, then at Mrs. Cunningham, and for the first time in a long while he felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The storm outside began to pick up, the rain tapping softly against the windows, but inside, for just a moment, it felt like something had shifted. Something had begun to change. Mr. Hayes knew this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. The days after that conversation felt different, like the air had shifted just enough to create the possibility of something new. The store, which had once felt like a place of transactional indifference, began to take on a new kind of energy. It wasn't obvious at first, not to the casual observer at least, but Mr. Hayes could feel it. A subtle change was happening, and though it was small, it was undeniable. Kyle seemed more engaged now, his posture straighter, his tone more respectful when customers came in. He greeted them with a warmth that had been missing before, and Mr. Hayes noticed that he was more willing to go the extra mile, to help someone carry their bags or offer a few words of encouragement to someone who seemed down. It wasn't a complete transformation, not by any means, but it was a start. And then there was the corner. It was nothing more than a small section at the back of the store, tucked between the canned goods and the dairy aisle. It was nothing fancy, just a table with a few boxes labeled with handwritten signs, "Free to those in need." A simple gesture, but one that carried weight. On that table were things people often took for granted: a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, cans of beans and rice. Items that people didn't always have the luxury of affording, even if they needed them. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. Mr. Hayes had visited the store every day, not to make a show of his presence, but to quietly observe. He watched the way people reacted to the new setup. At first, they were hesitant, unsure of whether they were allowed to take what was on the table. But soon, they began to see that no one was watching them, no one was judging them. They began to take what they needed, not with embarrassment, but with a quiet sense of dignity, as if they were finally being given permission to be human again. But there was still more work to be done. One evening, as Mr. Hayes walked into the store just before closing time, he noticed something different. Kyle was behind the counter, but there was a small group of people gathered near the back. Some regulars, a few new faces, and Mrs. Cunningham among them. They were talking in low voices, all of them looking toward the table in the back with a kind of reverence. As Mr. Hayes approached, he could hear bits of the conversation, mostly murmurs of agreement, the occasional laugh, but something else too. A kind of quiet solidarity. He stepped closer, and Mrs. Cunningham noticed him, giving him a small nod. "What's going on here?" Mr. Hayes asked, his voice soft but curious. "We're talking about this table," Mrs. Cunningham said, gesturing to the corner. "About how it's helping, how it's made a difference. I don't think any of us really expected it, but it's something, isn't it?" Kyle, who had been standing nearby, finally spoke up. "We're thinking about expanding it, maybe setting up a donation drive. People have been bringing stuff in. I didn't even ask them to, but they're doing it on their own." Mr. Hayes smiled, but there was a certain weight to his expression. "That's good, but it's not enough." The group fell silent at his words. They looked at him, waiting for him to explain. "What I mean is, this isn't just about giving things away," he continued, his voice steady, carrying a sense of urgency. "This is about building something more, something sustainable. You're going to need more than just food. You're going to need support, resources, a network, something that doesn't just feed people physically but also feeds their spirit, their sense of dignity." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Kyle shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Mr. Hayes and the group. Mrs. Cunningham, on the other hand, nodded slowly, as if the pieces were beginning to fall into place. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "This is just the beginning. People need more than just food, especially in a place like this. People need their sense of worth." There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the others in the group, and Mr. Hayes could see it. This was beginning to take shape, not as a simple charity, but as something that could grow into a true community initiative. But it wouldn't happen unless people were willing to step up and carry the weight of it together. "I've been talking to some of the others in the neighborhood," Mrs. Cunningham added. "I think we could set up something bigger, maybe a community pantry, or even a fund for people who need help with bills. This store could be a hub for it, not just a place where people come to get by, but a place where they're seen, where they matter." Mr. Hayes felt a surge of hope, but he held it in check, not wanting to give the impression that he thought everything could be solved overnight. Change took time, and people had to be willing to invest in it. Still, there was something in the air that felt different now, a sense of possibility, a crack in the walls that had kept people isolated for so long. "That's a start," Mr. Hayes said. "But don't let it stop here. People need to feel like they're part of this, like they're needed. If you want to make a real difference, you're going to have to get them involved, not just by giving, but by becoming a part of something bigger." Kyle, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke. "I don't know what this could become, Mr. Hayes, but I'm willing to try. Maybe we could have a community meeting, Let people come in, share ideas, see how they can help. That's the spirit, Mr. Hayes said, his smile growing. But remember, it's not just about what people can do for you. It's about what they can do with you. The idea of a community meeting seemed to take root in the group's mind. They began to discuss it in earnest, making plans for how they would set it up. Who would spread the word, where they could meet, how they would get the word out to everyone who might be interested. The conversation shifted from tentative murmurs to excited chatter, and for the first time in a long while, Mr. Hayes felt the weight of his own hopes lighten. As the evening wore on, more people trickled in, drawn by the promise of something new, something different. Word had spread, quietly at first, but now with a growing certainty, that this little corner store, once just a place to buy the essentials, was becoming something more. It was becoming a center of community, a place where people didn't just come to take, but to give, to share, and to belong. Mr. Hayes left the store that night with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt, but tonight something had shifted. Something real had begun to take shape, and it was clear that the ripple he had started was beginning to turn into a wave. In the days to come, more would join in. More would offer their time, their resources, and their ideas. And little by little, this small store, this once forgotten corner of the neighborhood, would become a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark the kind of change that could transform an entire community. But Mr. Hayes knew that the real work had only just begun. The store was no longer just a place to buy groceries. It was becoming the heart of something greater, a community built on respect, dignity, and the simple belief that no one should be left behind. And that, he thought as he walked home through the now quiet streets, was worth fighting for. In the days that followed, the community meeting became the talk of the neighborhood. Flyers were handed out at bus stops, and people spoke in hushed tones as they made their way down the street, passing the small store that was quickly transforming into something far more significant than a simple place to shop. Word spread, first through the regulars, then to those just passing by, and soon the date for the meeting was set. The night of the meeting arrived, and the store's aisles were cleared to make room for chairs and a large makeshift bulletin board with posters detailing the new initiative, the community table. The idea was simple. People could donate what they could, and in return, anyone who was struggling could come in and take what they needed, no questions asked. But it was also about more than just that. The initiative was about creating a space where people mattered, where no one was overlooked. Mr. Hayes arrived early, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement as he walked up to the store. There was a quiet excitement in the air, and it wasn't just because of the event. It was because something had changed. Something was different in the way people were looking at each other, as if they had suddenly been awakened to the reality that their neighbors were not just faces passing by. They were part of a larger, interconnected web. Kyle had clearly put in a lot of effort to prepare for the meeting. He had set up a table with refreshments and a few basic items, pens, notepads, and sign-up sheets for anyone willing to volunteer. The tables were arranged in a circle to foster a sense of community, not hierarchy. People arrived slowly at first, trickling in from the surrounding streets, looking uncertain, some with skepticism in their eyes, but others with a kind of hope that hadn't been seen around the neighborhood for a long time. Mrs. Cunningham was one of the first to arrive, her face set in a determined but hopeful expression. She greeted Mr. Hayes with a smile, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she settled into one of the chairs. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mrs. Cunningham said, her voice low as she took a seat beside him. "This isn't just about giving away food. This is about giving people back their dignity." "That's the idea," Mr. Hayes said, nodding slowly. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had been burning in him for decades. Mrs. Cunningham had lived through hardship, and now she was seeing a chance to make something better. For herself, for others, for the community. As the room filled, Kyle stood up and cleared his throat, signaling that it was time to start. The low hum of conversation died down, and all eyes turned to him. He seemed a little nervous, his hands shaking as he adjusted the microphone. Hey everyone," Kyle began, his voice cracking slightly. "Thanks for coming out tonight, we really appreciate it. This whole thing started with just an idea. You know Mr. Hayes here, you all know him. He started the community table. And now we're here to figure out how we can make this more than just a place to get food." He paused, looking around the room as if trying to gauge the mood. The faces staring back at him were a mix of curiosity, hope, and uncertainty. Some of them looked skeptical. Others, like Mrs. Cunningham, were nodding along with understanding. "We want to create a space where people can feel like they belong," Kyle continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "A space where you're not just a customer, but a part of something bigger. We want this store to be a place where everyone has something to offer, and no one gets left behind. But we can't do it alone. We need everyone to pitch in. Everyone." A quiet murmur rippled through the room as people exchanged glances. Mr. Hayes could feel the weight of the moment, the anticipation of what might come next. It wasn't just about donations or supplies, or even the store itself. It was about what people were willing to give. Not just money or food, but time, care, and effort. They had to believe in each other. The meeting continued late into the evening. People shared their ideas for what could be done, creating a neighborhood bulletin board, organizing volunteer shifts, starting a small fund to help with utility bills for those who were struggling. A few people suggested setting up a clothes donation section, while others spoke of offering free workshops on budgeting, cooking, or even just mental health support. There was even talk of setting up a small job training program where people could offer their skills to others in the community. By the end of the night, there was a palpable sense of unity in the room. What had started as a humble idea, one man's desire to make a difference, had sparked something far bigger. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was growing. As people filed out of the store, shaking hands, exchanging numbers, and offering their help, Mr. Hayes stood near the door, watching them leave. Kyle came up to him, a tired but satisfied look on his face. "I think it's going to work, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice more sure than it had been in days. "I really think it's going to work." Mr. Hayes smiled, but his eyes were thoughtful. He had always known it wasn't going to be easy, but now, standing here amidst the quiet stirrings of change, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But even as the meeting wrapped up and the last of the chairs were put away, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. He had seen these kinds of movements before, small sparks that caught fire, only to burn out too soon. He had seen people come together, only to fall apart when the hard work began. Tonight was only the beginning. The real challenge would be keeping the momentum alive, ensuring that people didn't just come together for one night, only to forget the promise they had made to each other. And Mr. Hayes, though filled with hope, knew that the road ahead would not be as easy as it seemed. The weeks that followed the community meeting were both exhilarating and challenging. There was a growing sense of momentum, but with it came the usual hurdles: doubt, burnout, and unexpected obstacles. Still, despite the occasional setbacks, there was no denying that things were changing. The store, now officially known as the community table, had become a focal point for the neighborhood. The small donation area at the back had expanded, and Kyle had worked hard to make sure that people who needed food or other essentials could get them without feeling ashamed or embarrassed. The small volunteer team, made up of local residents, took turns stocking the shelves, organizing donations, and reaching out to other stores and organizations for help. People were beginning to see this store, this place, as something that belonged to all of them, not just as a business, but as a community asset. But change, as it often does, brought its own challenges. One evening, as Mr. Hayes made his way to the store, he noticed a commotion outside. A small crowd had gathered, and he recognized a few familiar faces from the neighborhood. At the center of the crowd stood a man he didn't recognize, a middle-aged man in a suit, his arms crossed as he spoke animatedly to Kyle. Mr. Hayes approached, his cane tapping quietly against the pavement. He caught snippets of the conversation as he neared. You can't just give things away like that, the man was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. This is a business, not a charity. If you keep doing this, you're going to run this store into the ground. Kyle looked defensive, his hands clenching at his sides. We're doing this for the community, man. People need help. We're not just giving things away, we're giving people dignity. We're not running a charity. We're building something bigger. The man shook his head, unconvinced. You think people will keep coming back? You think they're just going to start donating and volunteering all the time? No one wants to be part of this kind of thing. You're making a mistake, Kyle. Big mistake. Mr. Hayes stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. You don't get it, do you? He said, his eyes fixed on the man in the suit. This isn't about charity. It's about respect. It's about showing people they matter. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's you who doesn't belong here. The man's eyes flicked to Mr. Hayes, then back to Kyle. There was a tense silence before he finally scoffed and turned, walking away without another word. Kyle sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping with the weight of the confrontation. Mr. Hayes put a hand on his shoulder. Don't let him get to you, he said quietly. There will always be people who don't understand. But that doesn't change what we're doing here. What you're doing. Kyle nodded, though he still looked uncertain. I don't know if I can keep this up. I don't know if people will keep showing up. You keep showing up, Mr. Hayes said, his voice gentle but insistent. And so will they. As they both watched the man in the suit disappear into the distance, Mr. Hayes felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. The road ahead was going to be long, but there was no turning back now. Despite the challenges, the weeks that followed saw the community table continue to grow. Kyle found his rhythm, learning to navigate the delicate balance between running a business and fostering a space for the neighborhood to connect. Slowly, the store became more than just a place for free food and donations. It became a sanctuary of sorts. People came in not just to get what they needed, but to be seen, to be heard. Mr. Hayes spent his days quietly observing, his presence a steady anchor for the changes unfolding around him. He didn't need to say much. His mere existence seemed to remind people of what was at stake, the dignity of the community, the strength of solidarity, and the power of small acts that accumulated over time. But even as the store flourished, a sense of unease began to settle over the neighborhood. People were talking. Growing whispers began to surface about the store's increasing prominence. Some felt that the community table was becoming too big, too unwieldy. Others felt threatened by the idea that something so outside of the usual system could thrive. There was talk of new regulations, of people from outside the neighborhood trying to seize control of the project. And the biggest threat of all, something Mr. Hayes had feared, was the encroaching interest of larger businesses. One day, as Mr. Hayes walked down the street toward the store, he noticed a sign had been posted on the door of the vacant building next to the store. It was an ad for a new corporate chain, promising affordable groceries for all. It was a typical corporate move, but the timing of it was striking. The competition wasn't just about prices or convenience. It was about eroding the sense of community that had begun to blossom in the wake of the store's success. Kyle had noticed it too. He had been on edge, trying to juggle the increasing demand for the store's services with the growing skepticism of outsiders. As the community's success spread, so too did the interest of people who saw the movement as a business opportunity rather than a mission. That afternoon, as Mr. Hayes entered the store, he could feel the tension in the air. Kyle was behind the counter, his hands busy with paperwork, but his eyes were distant, focused on something else. Mrs. Cunningham was there too, speaking with a few of the regulars, her voice low but firm. Mr. Hayes approached the counter, his cane tapping against the floor. Kyle looked up, forcing a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We have a problem," Kyle said quietly, rubbing his face with his hand. "They're coming in. They're gonna try to push us out." "I figured as much," Mr. Hayes replied, his voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. "They won't stop until they've taken over every piece of this neighborhood. You know what's worse? Kyle continued, his voice filled with frustration. Some of the people who've been donating, they've been telling me they're not sure if they'll continue. They say it's too much work, too much uncertainty. They're worried this place won't last. They're afraid of what the new store will do to us. Mr. Hayes stood there for a moment, letting the weight of Kyle's words settle. He knew the store was facing its hardest challenge yet. They had worked so hard to create something real, something tangible. But now, it felt like it was all about to slip through their fingers. "We can't let it go," Mr. Hayes said, his voice firm, a deep resolve settling in his chest. "We've come too far, you've come too far, we can't let them take this away from us." Kyle sighed, leaning on the counter. "I don't know if we can win this. They've got money, power, and the backing of the city. We've got hearts, but I'm starting to wonder if that's enough." Mr. Hayes looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "Hearts," he said, "are the strongest currency of all, but they have to be backed up by action." He paused for a moment, then added, "This is where you're going to have to decide who you are, Kyle. This isn't just about keeping the store open, it's about what you're willing to fight for." Kyle looked down at the counter, then back up at Mr. Hayes. "I don't want to give up, but I don't know what to do next." "You don't have to do it alone," Mr. Hayes said, his voice filled with conviction. "You've got the community behind you. And it's not just about the store. It's about the people who believe in this. We've got to show them we're not backing down." The decision was made, even before the formal discussion had started. It was time to fight, not with violence or even with protests, but with what they had. Their unity, their resilience, and their unwavering belief that they were building something bigger than a store. They were building a movement. As Mr. Hayes turned to leave, his steps sure and steady, he saw a familiar face near the door. Mrs. Cunningham. She was holding a flyer in her hand, the same one he had seen posted in front of the vacant building. It was an invitation to an open house for the new corporate store. Mrs. Cunningham had been holding the flyer for a while now, her gaze fixed on it as though considering its meaning. "I thought I should let you know," she said quietly, handing him the flyer. "I think it's time we start doing something about this. The people who are really invested in this community, they're not going anywhere." Mr. Hayes took the flyer, his fingers tightening around it. "No, they're not," he said, his voice resolute. "And neither are we." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, planning, and quiet determination. It became clear that the fight for the community table was not going to be an easy one. The corporate chain was relentless, offering discounts and promises of convenience, while slowly picking off donors and volunteers who were becoming increasingly disillusioned with the idea of supporting a project that might not survive. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't see, was the heart of what had been built. The store wasn't just a place for people to drop off items. It was a place where people had formed real, lasting connections. Neighbors who had once barely acknowledged each other were now sharing their stories, their resources, their time. And that, Mr. Hayes knew, was something money couldn't buy. The key to their survival was simple. They had to show the neighborhood and the corporate giants that they couldn't be bought, that this wasn't just about food or services. It was about identity, about a shared belief in something that transcended profit margins. The community rallied. Volunteers came in droves, willing to work shifts, to help with everything from organizing donations to setting up fundraisers. They started a petition, one that highlighted the importance of community-driven efforts and how the corporate chain's arrival threatened to wipe out what had been created. They organized a series of community nights where people could come together, share a meal, and hear stories of how the store had impacted their lives. These were nights of solidarity, nights of reaffirmation that the store wasn't just about business, it was about belonging. When the day came for the grand opening of the corporate chain, the neighborhood showed up, not to shop, but to protest, quietly, peacefully, but with a force that could not be ignored. Mr. Hayes stood among them, his back straight, his cane in his hand, a calm smile on his face as he looked out over the crowd. He didn't need to speak to them. They already knew what was at stake. They were fighting not just for the store, but for everything it represented. The corporate chain's grand opening was a flop. Despite the company's grandiose promises and flashy promotions, the community had made its statement loud and clear. This was their space, their store, and they weren't willing to let anyone take it from them. That evening, as the last of the protesters trickled home, Kyle approached Mr. Hayes, his face tired but triumphant. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. "We actually did it." Mr. Hayes smiled, a deep sense of contentment settling in his chest. "You did it, Kyle. You led them. I only showed you the way." Kyle laughed, shaking his head. "No, you gave us the reason to fight. That's what matters." And as Mr. Hayes stood there, looking at the community that had rallied behind him, he knew that this was the kind of change that couldn't be undone. It was the kind of change that lived in the hearts of the people who believed in it, and that was worth more than anything money could buy. The battle had been won, but the real work, building a community where everyone mattered, was just beginning. Sometimes the greatest power lies in the simplest acts of courage and generosity. Never underestimate what one person, with the right heart, can do to change an entire community. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of kindness. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that truly matter.